Continuing on with Chapter 14, we're looking at the creation of the Industrial Revolution in the United States between 1790 and 1860. Now, Eli Whitney started the textile industry, or jump-started the textile industry in the United States by creating the cotton gin, which allowed cotton to be very profitable in the South, and thus allowed the textile industry to start growing up in New England. But textiles are not the only part of manufacturing. It's just one of the parts. It's the first phase that we see in the United States. But prior to this, another reason why the United States was so slow to begin their industrial revolution or their market revolution was because all the phases, or every time the United States had tried to start manufacturing, it came into direct conflict with Great Britain. So if you think back in times of war against Great Britain, such as the Revolutionary War or the War of 1812, these are periods of time when the United States actually made a little bit of headway in terms of starting manufacturing in the U.S. simply because we weren't trading with Great Britain at this time. But the second Great Britain came back into the picture, they flooded the market, or they dumped on the American market, and American manufacturing went away. But starting with that tariff of 1816 and moving forward, we start to see that protectionist tariff, which allowed for American manufacturing to start growing slowly. So starting with the textile industry and moving into other industries. Now, beyond just creating the cotton gin, Eli Whitney also had a huge impact on industrialization by perfecting what are known as interchangeable parts. Now, he created this for guns, and basically what this is prior to the creation of interchangeable parts, if you wanted to buy a gun, you would go to a gunsmith, and a gunsmith was a trained occupation. They would apprentice with somebody for several years. Every single piece and part of the gun was handcrafted and made specific for that gun, which made that gun extremely expensive. Now, by using interchangeable parts, every single piece and part on the gun can be taken off and put onto another gun. So the muzzle, the finger locking mechanism, the butt of the gun, every single piece and part, and you can tell how much I know about guns, would be interchangeable, meaning anyone can put it together. So by creating these interchangeable parts, first for guns and then obviously used in every other industry, it sped up manufacturing, because now you don't have to buy a product from a gunsmith or from a specialized person, because any person can put these products together. So they get put together much more quicker, and they get to put together much more inexpensively. We think of Eli Whitney with interchangeable parts. Later on, this is going to be used by Henry Ford in creating automobiles, but that's obviously not for a very, very, very long time to come. But the idea here is manufacturing, mass production. And so with the use of interchangeable parts and other such technology, manufacturing or industry in the United States starts to grow. Now, another major obstacle for industrialization in the U.S. is people were worried about liability. You need to protect yourself. And God forbid anything happen with your company or on your premises, and somebody could sue you for everything you own. Limited liability was a new creation in law at this time for businesses to protect themselves. You can, quote, incorporate your business, which now means you are a corporation. And so all of the liability is put on the business and not on you. So, as a rudimentary example, if I owned a restaurant and you slipped on the floor in my restaurant, if it was just my own personal property, you could sue me for everything that I personally owned. But if I incorporated, meaning I filed papers with the U.S. government to create a corporation, you could only sue the corporation. That's all that's at risk. So by creating limited liability for businesses at this time, by taking some of that risk away, it became more popular for people to start up these businesses. And going with this idea of communication technology at this time, the telegraph was created in 1844, which allowed for communication across the United States, which obviously, once again, helps businesses grow, because you can send messages all over the place and conduct business on a national level now. So, we've been talking about the creation of these factories, and particularly the textile factories. This factory system really was perfected in this textile industry, but the factory system ended this master apprentice program that had been going on in every business for forever. That idea that I will apprentice with somebody for several years to learn the trade and become a master at whatever my issue is. We no longer need as many skilled workers anymore. We can hire unskilled labor for a cheaper rate and make the same product by using these mass producing techniques in order to build up our products. So, looking at the factory system, particularly in the textile industry in New England, these spindle cities grew up all over New England. A spindle is part of what is created with the growing use of textiles. So these are the slums all around the factory where these quote unquote wage slaves lived and worked and ate and everything else. They obviously had very, very low pay, very, very long hours, unsanitary work conditions. There was no government regulation at this time. Unions were absolutely forbidden. They were seen as a criminal organization. And child labor was very common because children, you could get the same amount of work out of them for less pay. So it was not uncommon for children to be a large part of the workforce, particularly in these textile industries up in New England and the Middle States. In fact, in 1820, half of the American workers at this time were under the age of 10. But as this, and once again, this is our change over time, as that Jacksonian democracy started to infiltrate, as the focus on the common man came more and more and more, people started wanting more for themselves and more for their children. And as more of the common man were given the right to vote, they started focusing on having changes occur in the U.S. government and the U.S. society to benefit them. Now, this is absolutely not something that changes overnight. This is the beginning of the changes. This is going to be a long fought process between the owners of businesses and unions. But a small, small, small step in that direction to protect workers at this time came in 1842 with the court case of Commonwealth versus Hunt, which declared that all labor unions are not necessarily conspiracies if their methods are, quote, honorable and peaceful. So this is one tiny, tiny step for allowing labor unions to occur in the United States. This by no means fixes the entire problem, but it is a tiny step in protecting workers' rights. So these textile mills, these spindle cities, they replaced homespun clothes, meaning people used to spin their clothes at home if they couldn't afford ready-made pieces from Great Britain. So it only made sense then for these factories to hire those people that had been spinning clothes before, and those were obviously women. Now, another side effect for hiring women is you don't have to pay them as much at this time. So for the first real time in American history, employment is offered to young girls in these textile industries in New England and the Middle States. These are the factory girls that overwhelmingly go to work in these textile industries, working 13-hour days, and were watched at all times by the factory matrons because families were putting their faith that the factories would protect their young unmarried daughters and their virtue when they left their family farms to go work in these textile mills, such as in Lowell, Massachusetts, which is a prime example of where this factory system was put into place. So there was massive regulation and major rules for working in the factories simply because the factory kind of took over the role of father for these young girls. But it did give them some independence that they had not faced before. So in society during this time, we see a major clash in terms of cultural norms or cultural ideas. On the one side are these lower class girls that need to go to work in these factory systems because they have to. They can't, their families need the money for them working in these factories. But on the other side are middle class and upper class people that are looking down their nose at these working girls in the factory system. The term the cult of domesticity, which is extremely, extremely important, is that exact idea. that women shouldn't have to work, that this is a glorified role or image of women, that women should be put on a pedestal that can stay home and raise a family and be married and be wifey poo and the homemaker, that it is the woman's job to raise a family and to be at home. So this cult of domesticity really glorified the traditional role of wife and mother, and it went against the idea of women working. But yet, American society at this time would not have continued to function had it not been for women working. So it really is a dichotomy here between what is considered the norm and what is actually happening in society. Now, women that were not going to feel bad about working really focused on this idea of domestic feminism, that they can be independent, they can do all these things that women are doing, but still to some degree maintaining their traditional roles of wife and mother. So we start to see a change in the American family at this time. That the families are becoming more child-centered. The children are being taught to think for themselves to some degree based on these changing norms in American society. Here is an example of one of those factory systems. The women were required to live in approved housing around the factories. Here you see some of the rules and regulations that were required of all people working in the factories. Now, moving westward, now the South, and we will elaborate on this a lot more in the months to come, but the South is obviously focusing on agriculture, plantations, cotton growing, other cash crops. The North is focusing on industrialization. They're focusing on factories, etc. The West is focusing on growing food to feed the rest of the nation. And this is really only going to be possible because of the Industrial Revolution. Now, looking at the West, this Trans-Allegheny region, namely Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, this is really the breadbasket of the United States. This is where corn and grains and farm animals are being raised in order to feed the rest of the country. In fact, Cincinnati very acutely was known as Porkopolis simply because of all of the pigs that were going through Cincinnati at this time. But in order to feed the nation and even to feed the rest of the world, Western farmers needed to expand their fields. They needed to be able to cultivate more land in order to do this. That's extremely difficult with the technology that was available to them prior to the Industrial Revolution. It was next to impossible for a farmer to plow a huge amount of territory by themselves and grow as much agricultural products as was necessary at this time. So the Industrial Revolution really had an effect on farmers because all of the new industrial products coming out in the eastern factories were not just focused in the east, they were also focused on helping farmers. People like John Deere first created the light steel plow in 1837, which was a huge thing because this steel plow could be pulled by horses. You didn't need a team of oxen. And most farmers obviously had horses, so this only sought to expand the amount of land that was able to be plowed because people were able to work quicker with this light steel plow. Also during this period of time, Cyrus McCormick invented the mechanical mower reaper, or the combine as it's also known. For a farmer growing corn or wheat or anything, if they wanted to cut down their crops with sickles and scythes and all that, it would take a very, very long time. This was a mechanized piece of equipment that would do that in a very small amount of time. So it took over the work of 5 men working with a sickle and a scythe in order to cut down fields of wheat and corn and things like that using this mechanized piece of equipment. And so what we see here is because of the Industrial Revolution, or also known as the Market Revolution, farmers become businessmen. They're going from a subsistence style lifestyle where they're only focused on growing what they need to large scale farming that's going to feed the rest of the country and to some degree the rest of the world later on. And so each section of the United States is really focusing on one area for their industry. The South is focusing on cotton and tobacco and other cash crops. The North is focusing on industry, and the West is focusing on food. Here you see both that John Deere steel plow and the combine, or the mechanical mower reaper, created by Cyrus McCormick. Now, part of the market revolution or the industrial revolution also comes with a growth of transportation. We've already talked about this. The only reason people are willing to move westward is because they want to have good roads. They want to have the ability to get their products back to market. If those are not available, people are unwilling to move west and obviously start farms out west. So at the time of the Constitution, there really wasn't an effective transportation system in the United States. The first real change in this came with the Lancaster Turnpike, which ran from Philadelphia to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Very small window of opportunity, but the turnpike really became popular. It was a paved road that you would pay a fee to drive on, and people would invest in turnpikes. This is the start of building up an infrastructure in the United States. This spurred other turnpikes to grow and westward development. We also see the creation of the Cumberland Road. It was started in 1811 but not completed until 1852. That ran all the way from Maryland out to Illinois. So once again, creating a national road for people to ship their products back and forth between the West and the East. And most importantly comes the invention of the steamboat by Robert Fulton in 1807. The first steamboat was the Clermont. Using this steam engine technology, which was only possible during the Industrial Revolution, now boats were able to use two-way navigation. This is crazy important because before the only way boats could go would be downriver with the current. Now using the steamboat, they can travel upriver, which makes two-way navigation possible. You don't just have to float downriver, you can flow against the current as well. So this first steamboat really revolutionized American society at this time. We also see the creation of the Erie Canal. This is in the state of New York, traveling from New York City all the way to Albany, and this connected the Great Lakes as well. Mostly advocated by the governor at this time of New York, DeWitt Clinton, to create this Erie Canal. This is why New York is such a huge port town today, because now this gives an avenue for Western farmers to put their products on the Great Lakes, connect with the Erie Canal, and ship their products east that way, obviously using the steamboat. Prior to this, all agricultural products had to be shipped down the Mississippi River because it just wasn't possible to ship back to New York City. So with the creation of the Erie Canal, new settlements started springing up all along the canalway, all along the Great Lakes, places like Pittsburgh and Cleveland and Buffalo and all these places, prompting westward expansion. So here you see the Erie Canal moving from Buffalo all the way to Albany, which then connects with the Hudson River into New York City, but this connects with the Great Lakes as well. So, like I said, this natural flow of commerce had to go southward prior to this. But as we see the growing of canals, not just the Erie Canal, but other canals as well, and the growth of railroads east of the Mississippi River allow for more industry to grow in the United States by this point. By 1860, there were 30,000 miles of tracks, mostly in the north, of railroads. We're not going to see westward railroads till much, much later, so do not get this confused with that. And the communication as created by the Morse code and the telegraph helped to create industry on a national basis. New York City, like I said, became a national port because now products could just as easily flow east as they did down the Mississippi River. And so this continental system that was being created, this specializing in regions, which I've alluded to, New England and the North focusing on industry, the South focusing on cash crops with agriculture, and the West focusing on growing food, really helped to create a more modern United States. And last but not least, this idea of the market revolution, which you've always been taught is called the Industrial Revolution. These two terms are synonymous. What this is a national network of industry. The growth of industry, the growth of immigration in order to work in those industries, the growth of agricultural west because of all these industrial products being created, and the growth of communication and transportation spurs on the market revolution. We see during this time the creation creation of a wage system. Now, to us, this is the norm, that you go to work, you work a certain number of hours, you make a certain wage. But this is where it's being created. No longer are you going and becoming a master in something. You are working for a business. You are making a wage to sell manufactured products. And so with this comes the possibility of social mobility, meaning to move up the social ladder. Those rags to riches stories were very popular at that time, that people could be born very, very poor but become very, very rich by working hard. The reality was the gap between rich and poor was actually just getting bigger. The rich were getting very, very wealthy off of the Industrial Revolution, and the poor workers in these factories were getting much, much poorer. But the dream of social mobility is what kept America going at this time during the market revolution. And that is chapter 14.